The ivory invitation slipped from my trembling fingers, floating to the kitchen floor like a broken promise. 27 years of sisterhood. And I wasn't even listed as family. Madison Claire Hartwell requests the honor of your presence. But apparently not mine. Not really. Because tucked inside that elegant envelope was a handwritten note from our father. Sophia, you'll attend as a regular guest. Nothing more. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from. And if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. I stared at those words until they blurred together, my coffee growing cold on the granite countertop. Regular guest. After everything we'd been through together, after all the late-night conversations when Madison would crawl into my bed during thunderstorms, after teaching her to drive in our old Buick when Dad was too busy with his real estate empire to bother. Regular guest. The morning sun streamed through our family kitchen windows, casting long shadows across the breakfast nook where Madison and I used to share Saturday morning pancakes. Those days felt like ancient history now, buried under years of Dad's calculated coldness toward me and his obvious favoritism toward my younger sister. It started when I was 18 and announced my intention to join the Navy. Dad's face had turned the color of fresh brick, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of our dining room table. "Absolutely not," he'd said, his voice carrying that tone that had made corporate executives tremble during board meetings. "Hartwells don't serve. We lead from boardrooms, not battleships." But I'd already made up my mind. While Madison was planning her debutante ball and Dad was grooming her to take over Hartwell Properties someday, I was studying navigation charts and dreaming of commanding my own vessel. The sea called to me in ways that quarterly profit reports never could. The day I left for basic training, Dad didn't even come to the airport. Mom cried quietly into her handkerchief while Madison waved from the passenger seat of Dad's Mercedes, too young at 16 to understand why our family was fracturing. Dad sat rigid behind the wheel, staring straight ahead as if I were already gone from his life. That was 9 years ago. 9 years of climbing ranks, earning respect, and building a career that took me from the choppy waters off the coast of Virginia to the crystalline depths of the Pacific. 9 years of Dad treating my service like an embarrassing family secret, never mentioning my promotions at dinner parties, never displaying my commendation letters on his office wall next to Madison's college degrees and real estate licenses. Madison tried to bridge the gap for years. She'd call me during my shore leaves, updating me on family gossip and Dad's latest business ventures. She'd show up at family dinners with stories about my latest assignment, trying to force Dad to acknowledge my existence. But he'd simply changed the subject, asking about her latest property sale or her boyfriend Trevor's law practice. Trevor Mitchell. Even thinking his name made my jaw clench. Golden boy from a prominent Charleston family, perfectly groomed for the life Dad had always envisioned for his daughters. Law degree from Duke, partnership track at a prestigious firm, and absolutely zero understanding of anything beyond his privileged bubble. When Madison announced their engagement last Christmas, Dad practically glowed with satisfaction. Finally, one daughter who was making, quote, appropriate choices. He'd immediately started planning what he called the wedding of the century, sparing no expense for Charleston's social event of the year. But planning apparently didn't include consulting me about anything meaningful. The phone calls started coming in February. Madison, breathless with excitement, rattling off details about flowers and venues and catering menus. She'd ask for my opinion on color schemes and band selections, but whenever the conversation turned to my role in the ceremony, she'd grow quiet. "Dad thinks it might be better if you just attended," she'd finally admitted during one particularly awkward phone call in March. "You know how he gets about military stuff. He doesn't want the wedding to become about your service record." About my service record. As if 9 years of dedication, 3 commendations for excellence, and my recent promotion to lieutenant commander were somehow embarrassing family trivia. The breaking point came during Easter dinner. I'd managed to get leave time and flew home to Charleston, hoping to discuss wedding plans face-to-face. The Hartwell family estate looked exactly the same as always. Perfectly manicured gardens, gleaming white columns, and enough square footage to house a small village. Mom had prepared my favorite lamb roast, and for a brief moment it felt like old times. Until Dad started talking about the wedding guest list. "We're expecting nearly 300 people," he announced, cutting his meat with surgical precision. The cream of Charleston society. Senator Williams confirmed his attendance, along with Judge Patterson and the entire Charleston Business Council. Madison beamed, her engagement ring catching the light from our crystal chandelier. Trevor's parents are flying in with their closest friends from Atlanta and Savannah. It's going to be absolutely magical. What about the wedding party? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. Have you finalized your bridesmaids? The silence that followed could have frozen the Atlantic. Madison's fork clinked against her plate as she set it down carefully. Mom suddenly became very interested in her wine glass. Dad cleared his throat. Madison has chosen her college sorority sisters for the bridal party. It seemed most appropriate. Most appropriate. Code for no military personnel allowed. Dad, Madison started, her voice wavering slightly. The decision is made, he interrupted, not even looking at me. Sophia will attend as our guest, naturally. But this is Madison's day, and she deserves to have everything perfect. Everything is perfect, meaning everything is civilian. I felt something cold settle in my chest, a familiar numbness that I'd learned to deploy during difficult missions. I see. You understand, don't you, sweetheart? Mom asked, her voice practically pleading. Your father just wants. I understand perfectly, I said, standing from the table. Madison deserves the perfect wedding. And apparently, that doesn't include her sister in any meaningful way. Madison's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't speak up. She never spoke up when it came to challenging Dad's decisions. I'd left Charleston that night, catching the red-eye back to Norfolk Naval Base with a bitter taste in my mouth and a growing certainty that my own family saw me as an inconvenience to be managed rather than a daughter to be celebrated. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of duty assignments and training exercises. I threw myself into my work, accepting every additional responsibility and volunteer mission that came my way. It was easier than thinking about Madison's upcoming wedding, easier than acknowledging how completely I'd been erased from what should have been one of our family's most important celebrations. My fellow officers noticed the change. Commander Rachel Torres, my mentor and friend, cornered me one afternoon in the officers' mess. You're pushing yourself too hard, Hartwell, she said, settling across from me with her coffee. When's the last time you took actual leave time? I'm fine, Commander. That's Lieutenant Commander Torres to you, and that wasn't a request for your psychological assessment. That was an observation from someone who's watched you work 18-hour days for the past month. Rachel had always been direct. It was one of the qualities that had made her such an effective leader and earned her the respect of everyone under her command. She'd risen through the ranks faster than almost anyone in recent Navy history, breaking barriers and setting precedents with every promotion. Family stuff, I finally admitted. My sister's getting married next month. And I'm not at the wedding party. I'm barely even invited. Rachel's expression darkened. Because of your service? The question hung between us like an anchor. Because that's what it really came down to, wasn't it? Dad's embarrassment about having a daughter who chose military service over country club membership. My father thinks Navy uniforms don't photograph well with Charleston society. Your father's an idiot. I nearly choked on my coffee. Commander? Lieutenant Commander Torres, she corrected again, but her expression had softened slightly. And I stand by my assessment. You've earned every stripe on that uniform, Hartwell. You've led missions that would make seasoned veterans nervous, and you've done it with honor and distinction. If your family can't see that, the problem isn't with you. But knowing that intellectually and feeling it emotionally were two entirely different battles. The formal invitation arrived the following week, along with Dad's note relegating me to guest status. I'd stared at that ivory cardstock until the words burned themselves into my memory. Madison Claire Hartwell and Trevor James Mitchell request the honor of your presence. The honor of my presence. Just not the honor of my participation. Standing in my apartment kitchen that morning, watching the invitation flutter to the floor, I made a decision that would have shocked my 18-year-old self. I wasn't going to Charleston for the wedding. I couldn't sit in those pews like a stranger, watching my sister promise her life to someone while our father pretended I was just another guest who happened to share our last name. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. I picked up my phone and started typing a text to Madison. Congratulations on your upcoming wedding. Unfortunately, I won't be able to attend. But before I could hit send, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. Madison's name flashed across the screen, and against my better judgment, I answered. Sophia? Her voice was thick with tears. I needed to hear your voice. Madison, please don't say you're not coming, please. I know Dad's being impossible. I know this whole situation is awful, but I need you there. You're my sister. You're the only person who taught me how to be brave. Those words hit me like a rogue wave, unexpected and overwhelming. Madison, brave? The girl who'd hidden behind me during horror movies and called me crying when her college boyfriend broke up with her? I taught you to be brave by leaving for the Navy. You taught me to be brave by choosing your own path, even when it meant disappointing Dad. Even when it meant being alone. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar weight of command decisions settling on my shoulders. This time, though, it wasn't about mission parameters or tactical advantages. This time, it was about family and love and the complicated mathematics of forgiveness. Okay, I heard myself saying, I'll be there. The relief in Madison's voice was palpable. Really? You promise? I promise, but Madison, I can't pretend this doesn't hurt. I can't pretend that being treated like a distant relative at your wedding doesn't feel like a betrayal. I know, and I'm sorry. I should have fought harder for you. I should have told Dad that having you at the wedding party wasn't negotiable. Should have. Past tense. But she hadn't, and we both knew it. It's done now, I said. I'll be there as your guest, and I'll smile for the photos, and I'll dance at the reception. But after this, Madison, things need to change between us. Between all of us. They will, she promised. After the wedding, things will be different. I wanted to believe her. I really did. 2 weeks later, I found myself standing in the guest room of our family estate, staring at the dress uniform hanging in the closet. I'd brought it on impulse, some stubborn part of me, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there would be a moment when wearing it felt appropriate. But looking at it now, with the sounds of wedding preparations echoing through the house below, I knew it would stay in that closet. Today I would be Sophia the guest, not Lieutenant Commander Hartwell. Today I would blend into the background of Charleston society and watch my sister marry a man who would never understand the sister who'd helped raise her. The house buzzed with activity as vendors and wedding planners transformed our home into something from a fairy tale. Flowers arrived by the truckload, a string quartet set up in the garden, and caterers claimed the kitchen like an invading army. I stayed out of the way, watching the controlled chaos from my bedroom window and trying not to think about all the ways this day could have been different. The morning of the wedding arrived with Charleston's typical late spring humidity, the kind that made even the most expensive silk cling uncomfortably to your skin. I woke at 05:00 hours out of habit, muscle memory from years of naval discipline, and found myself alone in a house that felt more like a luxury hotel than the place where I'd grown up. Madison's bridesmaids had arrived the night before, a collection of perfectly manicured sorority sisters who spoke in excited whispers about designer shoes and destination honeymoons. They'd claimed the entire second floor, transforming bedrooms into makeshift salons with curling irons, makeup palettes, and champagne flutes that never seemed to empty. I'd tried to join their pre-wedding festivities briefly, standing awkwardly in the doorway of Madison's childhood bedroom while they discussed wedding trends I'd never heard of. Their conversation died the moment I appeared, replaced by polite smiles and the kind of careful silence that comes when people don't know how to include you in their world. Sophia, Madison had called out, her voice overly bright. Come in, we were just talking about honeymoon destinations. But her friends had already returned to their conversation, and I could feel my outsider status like a physical weight. These women knew Madison's college stories, her sorority traditions, her favorite restaurants in Charleston. They belonged to her current life in ways I never would. I'll let you ladies get back to your preparations, I'd said, backing out of the room with what I hoped looked like a gracious smile. Now, in the pre-dawn quiet, I could hear them stirring upstairs, their excited chatter filtering through the floorboards. Hair appointments at 8, makeup trials at 10, photographer arriving at noon, a carefully orchestrated timeline that left no room for sisters who didn't fit the aesthetic. I pulled on running gear and slipped out the kitchen door, my feet finding the familiar rhythm of a morning run through Charleston's historic district. The cobblestone streets were empty except for delivery trucks and the occasional early-rising tourist. Spanish moss hung like ancient curtains from centuries-old oak trees, and the sweet scent of Confederate jasmine mixed with salt air from the harbor. This was the Charleston I remembered from childhood, before it became a backdrop for Dad's social climbing and business networking. Running these streets cleared my head in ways that shipboard fitness routines never quite managed. My route took me past the harbor, where fishing boats were already heading out for their morning catch. The sight of working vessels always steadied my nerves. These were people who understood honest labor, who earned their living through skill and dedication, rather than family connections or inherited wealth. By the time I returned to the house, the transformation was already underway. White roses and baby's breath covered every surface, elegant ribbons draped the grand staircase, and rental chairs created perfect rows in our backyard garden. Professional photographers moved through the space like choreographed dancers, capturing every detail of what would undoubtedly become Charleston's wedding of the year. Mom intercepted me at the kitchen door, her face already showing the strain of hosting duties. "Sophia, sweetheart, you'll need to stay clear of the main areas today. The photographers are working, and we can't have any disruptions." Disruptions. Another euphemism for my unwanted presence. "Where would you like me to get ready?" I asked, keeping my voice neutral. "Your father arranged for you to use the guest cottage. It's quieter there." The guest cottage, a charming outbuilding that sat 50 yards from the main house, originally built for visiting relatives in an era when families actually welcomed extended visits. Now it would serve as my exile headquarters, far enough away that I couldn't accidentally photobomb any precious wedding memories. I spent the morning in that cottage, watching through lace curtains as vendors continued their setup. The florist arrived with arrangements that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. The caterer unloaded enough food to feed a small army. The band sound-checked equipment that looked more sophisticated than some military communications gear I'd worked with. Around noon, Dad appeared at my cottage door, looking every inch the successful patriarch in his custom-tailored tuxedo. His silver hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to mirror brightness, and his expression carried that familiar mixture of authority and disappointment that I'd learned to recognize as his default setting when dealing with me. "Sophia," he said, not quite meeting my eyes, "we need to discuss today's arrangements." "I'm listening." He stepped inside the cottage, his gaze sweeping over my modest preparations. I'd chosen a navy blue cocktail dress, elegant but understated, something that would photograph well without drawing attention. My hair was pulled back in a simple chignon, military precision adapted for civilian occasions. "You look appropriate," he said finally, and somehow managed to make it sound like an insult. "Thank you, Dad, I aim to please." His jaw tightened at my tone. "Let's be clear about expectations. You'll sit in the back section with other extended family and family friends. During the reception, you're welcome to enjoy dinner and dancing, but please remember that this is Madison's day. Trevor's family will be watching, and first impressions matter for their future. First impressions. Because God forbid Trevor's family discover that the Hartwells had produced a daughter who chose service over society." "Understood," I said. "Anything else?" "The photographers have been instructed to focus on immediate family for portraits. You're welcome to take pictures with guests, of course, but we want to keep the formal photography streamlined." Streamlined, meaning without me. "Crystal clear, Dad." He studied my face, perhaps looking for signs of rebellion or emotional breakdown. When he found neither, his expression softened slightly, not quite warmth, but something approaching human recognition. "Sophia, this isn't personal, it's just business, I know." He nodded, relieved that I understood the transaction. "Madison loves you, we all do. But sometimes love means making difficult choices about what's best for everyone involved." What's best for everyone involved? The mathematical equation of family politics, where my presence was apparently a negative variable. After he left, I sat alone in the cottage for a long time, listening to the distant sounds of wedding preparations and trying to reconcile the man who just dismissed me with the father who used to read me bedtime stories and teach me to sail on Charleston Harbor. That man felt like ancient history now, buried under years of business success and social expectations. The father who'd once been proud of my school achievements and encouraged my independence had been replaced by someone who saw my life choices as personal failures. At 3 o'clock, I walked across the garden to join the other extended family and family friends in the back section of white rental chairs. The seating arrangement told its own story. Immediate family in the front rows, business associates and social connections in the middle, and people like me relegated to the cheap seats where we couldn't accidentally spoil the aesthetic. I recognized some faces from childhood, family friends who'd watched me grow up, distant cousins who showed up for major celebrations, elderly neighbors who'd known the Hartwell family for decades. They greeted me warmly, asking about my military service with genuine interest and pride. Their enthusiasm felt like cool water after wandering through a desert of polite indifference. Mrs. Eleanor Pemberton, our next-door neighbor since before I was born, grabbed my hand with surprising strength. "Sophia Hartwell, look at you. I heard about your promotion, Lieutenant Commander. My goodness, we're all so proud of what you've accomplished." Her words hit harder than I'd expected. Someone was proud. Someone besides my fellow officers understood that my achievements mattered. "Thank you, Mrs. Pemberton. That means more than you know." "Nonsense," she said, patting my hand. "Your service honors this family, whether they're smart enough to realize it or not." The ceremony began promptly at 4 o'clock, with Trevor and his groomsmen taking their positions at the altar. The officiant, a family friend who'd known Madison since childhood, spoke about love and commitment, while I tried not to think about all the ways this scene could have included me. Madison appeared at the garden entrance like something from a fairy tale, her dress a masterpiece of silk and lace that probably cost more than my annual housing allowance. Dad walked beside her, his face glowing with pride and satisfaction. This was his moment, his successful daughter making the approved choice with the appropriate partner. She looked beautiful, genuinely breathtakingly beautiful, and for a moment, watching her glide down that petal-strewn aisle, I forgot about my hurt feelings and simply felt happy for my little sister. The ceremony itself was everything Charleston society expected: elegant, traditional, and perfect for the photographers capturing every moment. Madison and Trevor exchanged vows they'd written themselves, promising to build a life filled with love, adventure, and mutual support. Their words were genuine and heartfelt, and I found myself tearing up despite everything. When the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, the garden erupted in applause and joy. Rice flew through the air. Real rice, not the bird-safe alternatives most venues required, and the newlyweds walked back down the aisle in a bubble of happiness that made everything else fade into background noise. The receiving line formed immediately, guests queuing to congratulate the happy couple and their families. I hung back, letting others go first, uncertain about my place in this tradition. When my turn finally came, Madison grabbed me in a fierce hug that lasted longer than protocol required. "I'm so glad you're here," she whispered in my ear. "I love you, Sophia." "I love you too," I whispered back, and meant it completely. Trevor shook my hand politely, his smile genuine but distant. We'd never really connected during the few times we'd met, our conversations staying safely within bounds of weather and current events. He wasn't unkind, just uninterested in getting to know the sister who didn't fit his vision of family expectations. Dad's handshake was brief and formal, more appropriate for business associates than father and daughter. Mom kissed my cheek and told me I looked lovely, her voice carrying undertones of apology for circumstances beyond her control. The cocktail hour flowed seamlessly into dinner, with guests mingling on the terrace while servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvre that were small works of art. I found myself gravitating toward the other military family members, a retired Army colonel who was Trevor's uncle, a Coast Guard captain married to one of Mom's cousins, and a young Marine lieutenant who'd served with distinction in recent overseas deployments. These conversations felt natural, unforced. We spoke the same language of service and sacrifice, understood the peculiar challenges of military life, and shared stories that didn't require explanation or context. For the first time all day, I felt like myself instead of an uncomfortable appendage to the Hartwell family narrative. The retired Colonel, Franklin Morrison, had served 3 tours in Vietnam and understood family dynamics around military service better than most. Some families struggle with the concept of duty beyond personal advancement, he said quietly, watching Dad work the crowd like a seasoned politician. They see service as something that takes their children away rather than something that makes them stronger. How do you handle it? I asked. Patience. And the knowledge that respect earned through service lasts longer than respect bought through social connections. His words stayed with me as the evening progressed, through dinner courses that showcased Charleston's finest culinary traditions and speeches that praised Madison and Trevor's bright future together. But something was building in the back of my mind, a sense that this evening wasn't finished with surprises. The guest list included people I didn't recognize. Older men with bearing that suggested military backgrounds. Women whose posture and attention to detail spoke of lives lived with purpose and discipline. One guest in particular caught my attention during dinner. He sat at a table near the front, distinguished in the way that comes from years of command responsibility. His hair was silver white, his posture ramrod straight, and something about his presence commanded respect from everyone around him. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen him before, though I couldn't place where or when. As the evening moved toward dancing and celebration, that feeling of anticipation grew stronger. The stage was being set for something, though I had no idea what. The band struck up their first dance song, and Madison and Trevor took the floor while photographers captured their fairy tale moment. Other couples joined them gradually, the celebration shifting into its final phase. I stood at the edge of the dance floor, content to watch and slowly beginning to plan my graceful exit. I'd fulfilled my promise to Madison, attended her wedding with dignity, and managed to avoid any major family confrontations. But as I turned to retrieve my purse from the cottage, I noticed the distinguished older gentleman approaching with purposeful strides. Something in his bearing made me stop and wait. The distinguished gentleman approached with the measured pace of someone accustomed to command, his eyes fixed on mine with an intensity that made the busy reception fade into background noise. Every instinct I'd developed through years of military training told me this man was important, not Charleston society important, but genuinely significant in ways that mattered beyond social hierarchies. He stopped directly in front of me, his posture perfect despite what appeared to be 70-plus years of life experience. Up close, I could see the subtle details that marked him as a former military, the way he held his shoulders, the precise alignment of his formal attire, and something indefinable about his presence that commanded attention without demanding it. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell, he said, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent making decisions that affected thousands of lives. My spine straightened involuntarily, muscle memory responding to the tone of a superior officer, even though we were both in civilian clothes at a wedding reception. Sir. Admiral William Blackwood, United States Navy, retired. He extended his hand, and I shook it with the firm grip that protocol demanded. I served with your commanding officer, Rachel Torres, during her early carrier rotations. She speaks very highly of your leadership capabilities. The world seemed to tilt slightly. Admiral Blackwood. I knew that name, knew his reputation, even though we'd never met. He'd commanded the Pacific Fleet during some of the Navy's most challenging operations in recent decades, earned congressional recognition for strategic innovations, and mentored officers who now held senior positions throughout the service. Admiral, it's an honor to meet you, sir. Commander Torres is an exceptional leader. Indeed she is, and according to her communications, so are you. His eyes swept over the reception, taking in the elegant crowd, the expensive decorations, and the general atmosphere of Charleston high society. Interesting guest list your family has assembled. Before I could respond, I noticed movement in my peripheral vision. Dad was making his way toward us, his expression shifting from polite host enthusiasm to something approaching concern as he recognized that I was engaged in conversation with someone clearly important. Admiral Blackwood, Dad said as he reached us, extending his hand with the practiced charm of a successful businessman. Richard Hartwell, Welcome to our home. I hope you're enjoying the celebration. Mr. Hartwell. The Admiral's handshake was perfunctory, polite but notably lacking warmth. Congratulations on your daughter's marriage. Beautiful ceremony. Thank you. Are you a friend of the Mitchell family? I don't believe we've been introduced before tonight. Actually, I'm here because of Lieutenant Commander Hartwell. The Admiral's words fell into the conversation like stones into still water, creating ripples that I could feel even before Dad's expression changed. I'm sorry, I don't understand, Dad said, his voice taking on the carefully controlled tone he used when business negotiations weren't proceeding as expected. Your daughter's naval service, Mr. Hartwell. Her reputation precedes her in certain circles. Admiral Blackwood's tone remained conversational, but something steel-hard lay beneath the polite surface. I was in Charleston for another engagement and learned she would be attending this function. Couldn't pass up the opportunity to meet an officer I've heard so much about. Dad's face went through several micro-expressions: confusion, realization, and something that might have been panic. The idea that someone of obvious importance had come to his daughter's wedding specifically to meet me was clearly not computing with his carefully constructed worldview. Sophia never mentioned she knew you, Admiral, Dad said, and I could hear him trying to regain control of a conversation that had veered into unexpected territory. We hadn't met until tonight, I clarified, equally confused by this turn of events. Admiral, if I may ask, what engagement brought you to Charleston? Naval War College Symposium on Leadership Development. 3 days of presentations and panel discussions about identifying and nurturing exceptional officers for senior command positions. His eyes never left Dad's face as he spoke. Your daughter's name came up repeatedly during those discussions. The words hit Dad like a physical blow. I watched his face cycle through emotions he clearly hadn't expected to feel tonight: surprise, pride, confusion, and something that might have been regret. The symposium included case studies of outstanding junior officers who demonstrate command potential. Admiral Blackwood continued. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell's leadership during the recent Pacific training exercises earned particular attention. Her tactical innovations and crew management techniques are being studied at the Academy. My mouth went dry. Being studied at the Academy? I'd known the Pacific exercises had gone well, had received commendations for the outcomes, but this level of recognition was beyond anything I'd imagined. Studied how? I managed to ask. Your approach to multi-vessel coordination during the storm simulations saved what could have been a catastrophic training accident. Your quick thinking and ability to maintain crew morale during 18 hours of crisis conditions demonstrated exactly the kind of leadership the Navy needs in senior positions. The reception continued around us, but our small circle had become isolated in a bubble of conversation that felt increasingly surreal. Other guests danced and laughed and celebrated Madison's marriage, while my father learned that his embarrassing military daughter was apparently somebody important after all. The recommendation has already been submitted, Admiral Blackwood said, addressing me directly. Captain's Review Board next spring. If approved, you'll be one of the youngest officers to achieve that rank in recent Navy history. Captain? The word resonated through my chest like a struck bell. Captain meant command of my own vessel, responsibility for hundreds of crew members, and recognition as a senior leader within the naval hierarchy. It was a goal I'd dreamed about, but hadn't dared hope might come this quickly. Sir, I had no idea my performance was being evaluated at that level. The best officers rarely do. They're too busy doing the job to worry about politics or recognition. His gaze shifted back to Dad, whose face had gone pale beneath his wedding day tan. Which brings me to why I wanted to meet your family tonight. Dad swallowed visibly. Oh. Naval tradition, Mr. Hartwell. When an officer achieves significant recognition, it's customary to acknowledge the family support that made such achievement possible. The sacrifices families make for military service often go unrecognized, but they're essential to our success. I felt something cold form in my stomach. Dad's support? The years of disappointment and embarrassment about my career choice were about to be exposed in front of someone whose opinion actually mattered. Of course, Dad said weakly. We're very proud of Sophia's service. Excellent. Then you won't mind if I share a story with some of your other guests? Several people have expressed interest in learning more about the Lieutenant Commander's achievements. Before Dad could respond, Admiral Blackwood was already moving toward the center of the reception area, his presence naturally drawing attention from nearby guests. Conversation slowed and stopped, as people recognized that something significant was happening. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of decades spent addressing large groups, "if I could have your attention for just a moment." The band noticed the shift in atmosphere and let their current song fade to silence. Dancers stopped moving, conversations ceased, and all eyes turned toward the Admiral. Madison and Trevor, still on the dance floor from their recent song, moved closer with expressions of curious confusion. "My name is Admiral William Blackwood, United States Navy, retired. I apologize for interrupting this beautiful celebration, but I wanted to take a moment to recognize someone special who's with us tonight." My heart began pounding so hard I was certain everyone could hear it. This was not how I'd planned to spend Madison's wedding reception. This was not the low-profile attendance Dad had demanded. I had the honor this week of participating in a Naval War College symposium focused on leadership excellence. During those discussions, one name kept coming up, an officer whose recent performance has caught the attention of senior naval leadership across multiple commands. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. I could see Madison's face in the crowd, her expression shifting from confusion to dawning realization. "Lieutenant Commander Sophia Hartwell," Admiral Blackwood announced, his voice carrying across the garden like a clarion call. "Your daughter, Mr. Hartwell, is being recommended for early promotion to captain based on exceptional leadership during recent Pacific training operations." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Captain was a rank that carried serious weight, even among civilians who didn't fully understand military hierarchies. It meant command, responsibility, and respect earned through demonstrated competence. Her tactical innovations during a severe weather emergency prevented what could have been a catastrophic training accident. Her ability to coordinate multiple vessels while maintaining crew morale during 18 hours of crisis conditions demonstrated exactly the leadership qualities the Navy seeks in its senior officers. Dad stood frozen beside me, his face cycling through emotions too rapidly to track. The man who'd spent years treating my military service as an embarrassment was learning that his daughter was being discussed in the highest levels of naval command. Lieutenant Commander Hartwell represents the finest traditions of naval service: courage, competence, and commitment to something larger than personal advancement. Admiral Blackwood's eyes found mine across the crowd. "It's officers like her who ensure our nation's security and uphold the honor of the uniform." Then he did something that made my breath catch in my throat. Admiral William Blackwood, former commander of the Pacific Fleet, raised his hand in a crisp military salute, directed straight at me. "Respect the Admiral," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned silence. But he wasn't referring to himself. He was calling me Admiral, acknowledging not just my current rank, but the trajectory that would likely lead to flag officer status within the next decade. In naval tradition, it was both recognition of achievement and prophecy of future command. The crowd erupted. Applause thundered through the garden, as 300 wedding guests suddenly understood that they were in the presence of genuine military distinction. Other veterans in the crowd, Trevor's uncle, Mom's cousin's husband, the young Marine lieutenant, snapped to attention and returned the salute with precision that spoke of deep respect for service and sacrifice. Madison broke free from Trevor's arm and ran toward me, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped me in a fierce hug that nearly knocked me over. "Sophia! Oh my God, Sophia!" But my eyes were fixed on Dad, who stood motionless in the middle of the celebration, his face pale with the recognition of how completely he'd misjudged his daughter's value. The receiving line that formed around me was unlike anything from earlier in the evening. Guests who'd barely acknowledged my presence suddenly wanted to shake my hand, ask about my service, share their own military connections or family stories. Mrs. Pemberton beamed with vindicated pride, while Trevor's parents approached with newfound respect and interest in getting to know their new in-law. Through it all, Dad remained silent, watching as his carefully constructed social hierarchy rearranged itself around a daughter he'd tried to hide. Admiral Blackwood found me again as the initial excitement began to settle. "Lieutenant Commander, it's been my honor to meet you tonight." I look forward to following your continued service. Thank you, sir, for everything. I'm not sure I understand why you did this, but because recognition matters, and family support matters more than most people realize. Your achievements deserve to be celebrated, not hidden. His eyes found Dad again. Sometimes people need help understanding what they have. As the Admiral prepared to leave, Dad finally approached us, his expression uncertain for perhaps the first time in my adult memory. "Admiral Blackwood," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Thank you for sharing that information about Sophia. I had no idea her service was being recognized at such high levels. Mr. Hartwell, your daughter is destined for significant leadership within the Naval Service. The Navy invests considerable resources in identifying and developing officers with her potential. We consider her family support network an important part of that investment." Dad nodded slowly, processing implications that clearly hadn't occurred to him before tonight. "I see. I hope you do," Admiral Blackwood said simply. Then he turned to me one final time. "Lieutenant Commander, serve with honor. The Navy is lucky to have you." After he left, I found myself standing with Dad in a pocket of relative quiet while the reception continued around us. Madison had returned to her guests, but kept glancing over with expressions that mixed joy, pride, and something that might have been relief. "Sophia," Dad said finally, his voice carrying an uncertainty I'd never heard before, "I think we need to talk." The weight of Dad's words hung between us like a challenge neither of us was quite ready to face. Around us, the reception had taken on new energy. Guests who'd witnessed Admiral Blackwood's dramatic recognition were now viewing the entire Hartwell family through a different lens. I could feel their curious glances, the whispered conversations about military honors and family dynamics that had just been publicly exposed. "Yes," I said finally, meeting his uncertain gaze with 9 years of accumulated hurt and newfound confidence. "I think we do need to talk." Dad glanced around the reception, his businessman's instincts clearly calculating the optics of our conversation. Too public, and it would become Charleston society gossip. Too private, and he might lose the nerve to address what had just happened. "Not here," he said. "Too many ears. Walk with me." He led me away from the garden reception, through the side gate that opened onto the sprawling grounds behind our family estate. The sounds of celebration faded behind us as we followed a brick pathway that wound through Mom's prize-winning rose garden toward the old gazebo, where Madison and I used to hold tea parties as children. The evening air carried the sweet fragrance of jasmine and the distant salt tang from Charleston Harbor. Fireflies were just beginning to emerge, tiny sparks of light dancing among the ancient oak trees that had sheltered our property for centuries. Under different circumstances, it would have been peaceful, romantic even. Tonight, it felt like walking toward a reckoning that was 9 years overdue. Dad's usually perfect posture showed signs of strain as we walked. His shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time in my memory, he looked older than his 58 years. The confident patriarch who'd dismissed my military aspirations and relegated me to wedding guest status had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely uncertain about what came next. We reached the gazebo without speaking, our footsteps echoing on the wooden steps as we climbed to the octagonal platform where Madison and I had once planned elaborate adventures and shared childhood secrets. The structure commanded a view of the entire estate, the main house glowing with reception lights, the guest cottage where I had been exiled that morning, and the harbor beyond where naval vessels occasionally passed, like distant reminders of the world I'd chosen over this one. Dad moved to the gazebo's railing, gripping the painted wood with hands that trembled slightly. The confident businessman who commanded boardrooms and dominated dinner conversations was gone, replaced by a father who was finally confronting the magnitude of his mistakes. "Sophia," he began, then stopped, as if the words he needed didn't exist in his usual vocabulary of quarterly reports and property acquisitions. "Take your time, Dad. We've got 9 years of conversation to catch up on." He flinched at the quiet edge in my voice. "I owe you an apology. Several apologies, actually. Just one will do if it's genuine." "It is." He turned to face me, and I was startled to see tears forming in his eyes. "I've been wrong about everything. your service, your choices, your value to this family. Tonight, what that Admiral said about you, I had no idea. You never bothered to find out. The simple truth hit him like a physical blow. No, I didn't. I was so focused on what I thought your life should look like that I never paid attention to what you were actually accomplishing. The admission hung between us, raw and honest in ways our family rarely attempted. Dad had built his entire identity around control, controlling business outcomes, social perceptions, family narratives. Admitting he'd been wrong about something this fundamental was clearly devastating his self-image. Why, I asked, why was my military service so threatening to you? He was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the harbor where container ships moved like floating cities against the darkening sky. When he finally spoke, his voice carried pain I'd never heard before. Because I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of losing you, afraid that once you left for the Navy you'd never really come back. Afraid that the life you chose would take you so far from us that we'd become strangers. He laughed bitterly. Which is exactly what happened, except it was my reaction that caused it, not your service. The revelation staggered me. All these years, I'd assumed his disapproval stemmed from embarrassment or social prejudice. The possibility that it came from fear, from love, however twisted, had never occurred to me. Dad, I never wanted to become a stranger. I wanted you to be proud of me. I was proud, I am proud, I didn't know how to show it without accepting that I'd lost my little girl to something I didn't understand. You didn't lose me, you pushed me away. I know. The words came out like a confession that had been weighing on him for years. Every phone call you made, every achievement you shared, every time you tried to include us in your military life. I shut it down because it reminded me that you'd chosen something else over the family business, over the life I'd planned for you. The life you'd planned for me wasn't my life, Dad. It was your life, reimagined with me as the starring character. He nodded slowly, processing the distinction. Your mother tried to tell me that. For years, she tried to make me understand that supporting your choices didn't mean losing you. But I was too stubborn, too convinced that I knew what was best. The mention of Mom opened another wound. She never stood up to you. Not once, in 9 years, did she tell you that treating me like an embarrassment was wrong. That's not fair to your mother, Sophia. She fought for you constantly, just not in ways you could see. Every guest list that included you, every family gathering where she insisted on setting a place at the table, every conversation where she shared your accomplishments whether I wanted to hear them or not. She never stopped trying to bridge the gap I'd created. I thought about Mom's behavior over the years, the careful way she'd updated me on family news, the photos she'd send of family gatherings with captions that always included, "We missed you," the Christmas presents that showed she'd been paying attention to my interests and needs even when Dad wasn't. She could have done more, I said, but with less conviction than before. She did what she could within the constraints of a marriage where one partner was being completely unreasonable about his daughter's life choices. Your mother has spent 9 years trying to manage my stupidity while keeping our family from completely falling apart. The honesty was brutal and necessary. Dad had always been good at taking responsibility for business failures, but personal accountability was newer territory for him. What changed tonight? I asked. What made you finally see what you'd been doing? Watching 300 people whose opinions I've spent years cultivating, look at you with respect and admiration while I stood there realizing I'd been treating my daughter like an inconvenience. Hearing that Admiral describe achievements I knew nothing about because I'd never bothered to listen when you tried to share them. He paused, struggling with emotions that clearly weren't comfortable for him. But mostly it was seeing Madison's face when she hugged you after the Admiral's announcement. Pure joy, pure pride in her sister. No reservation, no calculation, no worry about what other people might think. Just love and celebration for your success. The way I should have been reacting all along. Madison. The thought of my sister's unqualified happiness in that moment brought fresh tears to my eyes. Whatever else had gone wrong tonight, seeing her genuine pride in my achievements had been worth enduring everything else. She's always supported me, I said, even when it meant going against your wishes. I know. And I put her in an impossible position, loving both her father and her sister while we refused to find common ground. Tonight's wedding arrangements, forcing you to attend as a guest instead of family. I made her choose between us, and that was cruel to both of you. Why did you do it? Why was it so important to keep me out of the wedding party? Dad's face flushed with shame. Because Trevor's family represents everything I've worked toward in Charleston society. Old money, political connections, social influence that could benefit the family business for generations. I was terrified that having a military daughter in the wedding photos would somehow diminish their impression of us. And now? Now I realize that having a daughter who's being recommended for early promotion to captain, who's being studied at the Naval Academy for leadership excellence, who commands the respect of admirals. That's exactly the kind of family connection that matters. Not because of business advantages, but because it represents real achievement, real honor. The transformation in his perspective was dramatic, but I wasn't ready to forgive 9 years of rejection simply because an admiral had publicly embarrassed him into recognition. Dad, I'm glad you're finally seeing my service differently, but this can't just be about tonight. This can't just be about being impressed by Admiral Blackwood's recognition. My value as your daughter shouldn't depend on external validation from people you consider important. You're right. He moved away from the railing, pacing the gazebo's perimeter like a man trying to work through a problem that couldn't be solved with spreadsheets or contract negotiations. I've tied my sense of worth to other people's opinions for so long that I forgot how to value things independently. Your service, your achievements, your character, they were always worthy of pride and support, regardless of what anyone else thought. So what happens now? Do we pretend the last 9 years didn't happen? Do we start over like strangers, getting to know each other? I don't know, he admitted. I've never had to rebuild a relationship with one of my children before. I'm not sure what the protocol is for fathers who've been complete idiots about their daughter's life choices. Despite everything, I found myself almost smiling at his bewildered honesty. There is no protocol, Dad. We figure it out as we go. Can you forgive me? Not immediately, not without me proving that I've changed, but eventually? The question hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. Forgiveness meant vulnerability, meant risking future hurt, meant accepting that people could change even when they'd caused years of pain. I want to, I said finally. But forgiveness isn't just about saying the words. It's about both of us doing the work to build something different than what we had before. What would that look like? It would look like you are learning about my military career not because it impresses other people, but because you're genuinely interested in my life. It would look like you were introducing me as your daughter, the naval officer, with pride instead of reluctance. It would look like you making space for who I actually am, instead of mourning who you wanted me to be. Dad nodded slowly, absorbing the requirements like a business plan that needed careful implementation. And it would look like me giving you the chance to prove that you've changed, instead of holding on to hurt feelings forever, I continued. It would look like both of us choosing to build something new instead of staying stuck in patterns that haven't worked for anyone. I'd like that, he said quietly. I'd like the chance to be proud of my daughter in all the ways I should have been already. We stood in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the reception lights twinkle through the trees and listening to the distant sounds of celebration. Madison's wedding was continuing without us, but somehow that felt appropriate. This conversation needed to happen away from audience and social pressure, in the quiet space where honest words could take root. We should get back, Dad said eventually. Madison will wonder where we disappeared to. In a minute, there's something else I need to say. He waited, his expression open in ways I hadn't seen since childhood. Thank you for tonight, not for the recognition or the Admiral's speech, but for finally being willing to have this conversation, for being willing to admit you were wrong and to talk about changing things between us. Thank you for giving me the chance. And Sophia, for what it's worth, I'm incredibly proud of the woman you've become. Not because an admiral said I should be, but because you've built a life of purpose and achievement despite having a father who made it harder than it needed to be. As we walked back toward the reception, I felt something shifting in my chest. Not complete healing, because that would take time and consistent effort from both of us, but the beginning of possibility. The beginning of a relationship based on who we actually were instead of who we'd been fighting about for 9 years. The sounds of celebration grew louder as we approached the garden, and I could see Madison scanning the crowd, clearly looking for us. When she spotted us returning together, her face lit up with relief and hope. Whatever happened next, tonight had changed everything. The question now was whether we could build something worthy of that change. The reception had transformed during our absence. What began as a traditional Charleston society wedding had evolved into something more authentic, more celebratory. Admiral Blackwood's recognition had shifted the entire atmosphere, turning a routine social gathering into an evening people would remember and discuss for years. Madison spotted us before we'd even fully rejoined the crowd. She broke away from a group of her sorority sisters and hurried toward us, her wedding dress flowing behind her like something from a fairy tale. Relief mixed with cautious hope filled her expression. "There you are," she exclaimed, grabbing both our hands. "I was starting to worry you decided to continue your discussions somewhere in the next county." "We needed privacy for some things that were 9 years overdue," Dad said, his voice carrying a gentleness I hadn't heard him use when speaking about me in nearly a decade. Madison's eyes moved between us, reading the subtle changes in our body language. "Good conversation?" "Productive," I said. "We have a lot of work ahead of us, but tonight was a start." The relief that flooded Madison's face was intense. She'd been caught in the middle through no fault of her own, loving both her father and her sister, while watching us hurt each other through stubborn pride. Trevor appeared at Madison's elbow, slipping his arm around her waist. His expression had changed since Admiral Blackwood's announcement. Gone was the polite distance, replaced by genuine curiosity and respect. "Sophia," he said, extending his hand for a more substantial handshake than we'd ever shared, "I owe you an apology. I've been treating you like Madison's distant relative instead of her sister. That was wrong of me." "Thank you, Trevor. That means something." "I'd like to get to know you better, if you're willing. Madison talks about you constantly. Your adventures, your leadership style, the way you taught her to be brave." The band struck up a slower song, and couples began moving toward the dance floor. Madison and Trevor swayed together in the center while other guests formed elegant pairs around them. "Dance with me?" I turned to find Dad extending his hand, his expression vulnerable in ways I hadn't seen since childhood. Public dancing with his military daughter, something that would have been unthinkable earlier in the evening. "I thought you didn't want me drawing attention tonight," I said, but I was already accepting his hand. "I spent too many years worried about the wrong kind of attention," he replied as we moved toward the dance floor. Tonight I learned the difference between shame and pride, and I choose pride. Dancing with Dad felt surreal after years of careful distance. We fell into the familiar rhythm of formal ballroom steps I'd learned during cotillion classes. "Do you remember teaching me to waltz?" I asked as we turned gracefully among the other couples. "Of course. You were 12, determined to master every step perfectly. You practiced for weeks. You were patient with me, even when I kept stepping on your feet. You were worth being patient with. You've always been worth being patient with." Other guests watched us with expressions ranging from curiosity to approval. Mrs. Pemberton beamed from her table, clearly delighted to see the Hartwell family displaying actual affection. As the song wound toward its conclusion, Dad spoke quietly. "I have a favor to ask." "What kind of favor?" "Next weekend, I'm hosting a business dinner for potential investors. 15 couples, including some of the most influential families in Charleston. I'd like you to attend. Not as a hidden family member, but as my daughter, the naval officer. I want to introduce you properly, to show them the kind of family the Hartwells actually are." The request represented a fundamental shift in how he viewed both my value and his own priorities. "I might be called back to base by then," I said, testing his commitment. "Then we'll schedule around your availability. This isn't about convenience, Sophia. This is about making up for lost time and doing things differently going forward." The song ended, and we stepped apart with formal grace. Something essential had changed between us. Madison and Trevor joined us at the edge of the dance floor, both glowing with happiness. "So," Madison said, slipping her arm through mine, "I have a confession to make. On your wedding day, that seems like poor timing." Admiral Blackwood didn't just happen to be in Charleston for a symposium. I stared at her, processing the implications. "What do you mean?" I mean, I've been corresponding with Commander Torres for months, trying to understand your military career better. She mentioned that Admiral Blackwood would be speaking at the War College, and I might have reached out to him. Madison, what did you do? I wrote to him. I told him about your achievements, about our family situation, about how Dad was treating your service. I asked if there was any way to help him understand what you'd accomplished. She looked guilty but defiant. I couldn't stand watching you be erased from your own sister's wedding. The revelations stunned me. Quiet, socially appropriate Madison had orchestrated tonight's dramatic intervention, had reached out to a Navy admiral to advocate for her sister's recognition. How did you even know how to contact him? Commander Torres helped. She said admirals don't usually attend Charleston weddings, but exceptional circumstances sometimes call for exceptional responses. Dad's expression showed surprise, admiration, and proud recognition of his younger daughter's strategic thinking. That was remarkably brave of you, he said finally, and remarkably effective. I learned from my sister, Madison replied, squeezing my arm. She taught me that sometimes you have to fight for what matters, even when it's uncomfortable. The evening was winding down around us. Elderly guests were beginning their goodbyes, caterers were discreetly clearing tables, and the band was transitioning into their final set. I should let you get back to your other guests, I said to Madison. This is still your wedding day after all. It's been the perfect wedding day, she said, hugging me tightly. Better than perfect, because it ended with our family actually being a family again. As Madison and Trevor returned to their remaining guests, Dad and I stood together watching the reception's final hour unfold. The pressure and tension that had defined our relationship for nearly a decade had lifted. What happens when you get that promotion to captain? Dad asked. If I get the promotion, I corrected. When you get the promotion, he said firmly, what does that mean for your career trajectory? It was the first time he'd ever asked about my professional future with genuine interest. Command of my own vessel eventually. Probably a destroyer or frigate initially, with potential for larger commands as I gain experience. The Navy invests heavily in officers who reach captain rank early. Senior leadership meaning? Admiral track, potentially. Flag officer positions that shape naval policy and strategy. Dad nodded slowly, absorbing information about career paths he'd never bothered to understand. I'd like to learn more about all of this, he said. Not because it impresses business associates, but because I want to understand the world my daughter has chosen to serve in. I'd like that too, Dad. The band announced their final song, and the remaining guests gathered for one last dance. Madison and Trevor took the floor for their final moment as the center of attention. As I watched my sister dance with her new husband, surrounded by the glow of genuine happiness and family reconciliation, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Complete belonging in my own family story. The evening that began with my relegation to guest status had ended with recognition, understanding, and the beginning of relationships based on who we actually were rather than who we'd been fighting about for nearly a decade. Admiral Blackwood's intervention had been the catalyst, but the real change came from Madison's courage in advocating for her sister, Dad's willingness to confront his mistakes, and my own decision to forgive and build rather than hold on to justified hurt. As the final notes of music faded and guests began their goodbyes, I realized that sometimes the most important battles aren't won through conflict, but through the harder work of choosing understanding over pride, connection over control, and love over the comfortable distance of disappointment. Tonight, for the first time in 9 years, the Hartwell family was complete. Not perfect, but whole, and that felt like victory enough. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.